I'm very excited for today. And Trish, I believe you would like to give an introduction of our guest speaker today.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Trisha Bate here with Skip. I will introduce Tim and then turn it over to him. Tim Thomas is the research director at the Urban Displacement Project, specializing in urban sociology, demographic methods, and spatial statistics with a research focus on how neighborhood change, housing, and displacement affects household socioeconomic stratification by race and gender in the United States. Tim is also the principal investigator for the Eviction Study, a multi-metropolitan analysis on the neighborhood drivers of eviction. Tim's research agenda is marked by an intellectual foundation in policy-relevant research operationalized through civic and academic collaborations that address real-world problems. In 2019, his team's work on evictions provided empirical evidence that helped pass several tenant protection laws in Washington state. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Washington, and his dissertation identified racial and gender disparities in eviction filings in South King County in 2013, along with associated neighborhood segregation, housing market, and rent burden trends. Today, Tim will be discussing South King County evictions, BIPOC displacement, and history, as well as his work on the housing precarity risk model. I'm very excited to have Tim here with us and grateful he's willing to share his time with us. And before I turn over to Tim, I just wanted to mention that we would really like to have a reflective conversation after Tim's presentation, because we really want to apply what we are learning here to inform our work. So afterwards, we'd like to hear from you about the following questions. So just things to keep in mind as we move through the presentation. What caught your attention? Where were you surprised? What implications might this hold for us? What are the connections to our work? And how will we apply what we just learned? And with that, I will turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Trish, so much. And thank you, everyone, for having me. This is a real honor to be here. And I've spent almost 2 decades in the Seattle metropolitan area. And so I'm very passionate about the area, especially what's going on in South King County. And just very grateful for this opportunity to speak with everyone here. I'm going to share my screen here real quick, and let me know if you don't see it. Also, let me know if my audio or visual is kind of off. Every now and then, my signal kind of likes to take a little roller coaster dive. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about this dynamic around evictions, displacement, and housing precarity, in particular from my research that I did with my dissertation, as well as research I've done with the state of Washington, and also kind of pick up where we're at with the COVID-19 crisis, what we should expect, and what might be some things that could be done. Just to introduction myself, I got my degree at the University of Washington in Department of Sociology. I specialize in demography, urbanization, housing, all these other dynamics, and been working over the past 10 years really trying to apply a lot of this research for public policy. It's not an easy endeavor. Academics don't know everything. You all are the ones that are on the ground, and my approach is basically, I can come up with research questions all day, but these kinds of interactions are really what motivate the really good research questions. So I don't know everything. I just kind of observe, but I love interacting, and I feel like this type of research is part of what I think is like a 3-legged stool for policy to protect citizens. You know, the research helps motivate, that's one leg. The other leg is, advocates and folks on the ground, stakeholders, raising up these issues, talking about the stories of what's going on in terms of housing precarity. And then the third leg is policymakers like yourself who help drive and put these things on the table to think about it. And it's that 3-legged stool. Without one, it can be kind of wobbly. But, I think that we each play a very important role, and for us to break orbit on any kind of more policy and efforts to try and protect tenants and even work out, things with landlords and everything like that. It's important to kind of have that multifaceted approach. So before I begin, I'm going to start talking about this concept of forced migration or evictions to kind of situate us a little bit of where we're at. So if we think about this dynamic of mobility we can look at what I call this kind of mobility curve. On the bottom x-axis, we have this idea of economic status, higher income to the right, lower income to the left. On the y-axis, up and down, we have this dynamic of residential mobility. On the far right-hand side, folks that are higher income can move at any point they want. They can move to opportunity, they can move to better networks, better jobs, they can move in and out of state easily, things like that. These are the unforced moves. Folks that fall within middle income areas tend to not be as mobile. They tend to be situated where their job is, their family, they're choosing to stay within an area for various reasons. And so we see a lot less mobility within middle income households. But if we look on the left-hand side, we see again this kind of uptick of forced mobility. In other words, these are folks that maybe want to stick around in an area similar to what middle income folks want to do. But, you know, the cost of living increases too high. They can't afford to live in certain spaces. They face, you know, different types of issues that force them to move out. And it's this idea of where like rising rents kind of impacts a lot of populations. This is what I call soft displacement, where the cost of living increases out of the means of the individual, the household able to live. And on the far left-hand side, we see this is where evictions are. This is what I call hard displacement. These are people that are forced to move out without choice. They want to stay there, but a lot of times they just are unable to keep up and face eviction. We know a lot about these last 2/3, but we know very little about this first third. And so this is kind of the bulk of research that I do. And also a famous professor named Matthew Desmond wrote a book called Evicted. A lot of the work that he talks about, he says that evictions falls within this triangle of increasing rent, interacting with inadequate welfare or support systems, and compounded by housing burden, low wages, unable to meet the increases in rent. So in his research, he found that that even in lower income neighborhoods, the housing cost increases tend to outmatch the income costs. So these dotted lines are two-bedroom home cost rises in the Milwaukee area from 1997 to 2008, and this darker dashed line is single bedroom homes. Both of these have been increasing in cost over time. However, welfare had been stagnant through that period of time, and in fact, not meeting or even it's lower than the cost of housing by 2008, and welfare at the time had an increase in 2004, but still you're seeing this very close gap where rent is almost matching the cost or the income that folks have that are low income. A lot of his research pointed out that from studying court records that women are disproportionately affected or overrepresented in the eviction crisis, and Black evictions are incredibly high. Families with children, in fact, if you have a child in the household, that increases your likelihood of being evicted. For example, if your kid is making a lot of noise or something like that, and you happen to fall behind on rent, they may be more likely to evict you. Whereas if you don't have a child and you might fall behind on rent, people, landlords have been known to work out deals with folks that are a little bit more pleasant to be around or things like that. A lot of the neighborhoods where evictions happen, poverty plays a big role in terms of where evictions occur. Racial diversity is also a very high predictor of evictions. Latino households tend to get evicted in white neighborhoods way more than whites do in general. A lot of folks that have been facing eviction are owing upwards of 80 to 90% of their income to rent. This is a huge issue. Basically, they have a rational choice to decide whether or not they can pay for education, healthcare costs, food, all these other normal dynamics, and they either pay for that or they pay for housing. The dynamic of rent burden, basically you are rent burdened if you're paying more than 30% of your income towards rent. And the fact that they're paying 80 to 90% of their income towards rent just puts them way above the normal level. Outcomes of eviction, there's strong research that shows it leads to worse health. In fact, it can lead to homelessness, which is also a dynamic of doubling up. So higher exposures to COVID-19 are very high amongst those facing eviction. You can face layoffs because of instability of housing. It goes on your credit report. and it can lead to exposure to environmental hazards, involuntary displacement, and exposure to crime. And it deeply impacts your future opportunities for future housing. If you have an eviction on your record or your credit score gets impacted by an eviction, even if you're not forced out, say you work out, you are filed for an eviction and you actually work out a deal with your landlord, that filing can still be on your record and continue to impact your future opportunities. So the work that we do at the eviction study is largely focused on neighborhood dynamics on top of this. So looking at market and economic conditions, residential segregation, and neighborhood change and how they relate to it. Neighborhoods are very, very important. Where you live impacts your future opportunities and where that space is. You know, the exposures that you have to that space are pervasive and stable across time. Issues of residential segregation, I'll talk about this in a little bit, impacts mobility. It can lead to issues of concentrated disadvantage or uneven opportunities. You have a reduced political clout and more segregated spaces. And there are issues in research about this concept about commodification of spaces, where basically there's this winners and losers theory, basically, that if you don't have enough income to kind of maintain or defend your space, you may be forced to move, face eviction, face displacement, things like that. And a lot of these issues around, especially segregation and concentrated issues around poverty, can lead to folks being stuck in place, losing their opportunities to move to better places, be in better schools, and detaches them from the mainstream, and can lead to what is the biggest issue, the continuation of this problem, which is generational exclusion. So housing exclusion, the increasing racial wealth gap, and impacts on the opportunity to own. So I'm just going to start with what we found and kind of then try to explain what happened to lead to these kind of dynamics. So first of all, this is based on research that I did in 2018 and 19. This is kind of the trend of unlawful detainers. There are 3 points of eviction that you can really think about. There's the notice, and if you have right now, you have a pay or vacate of 14 days if you are able to pay, or you leave within that 14-day period. You know, there's no real record that goes on to that, but if you're unable to leave or vacate, it leads to an unlawful detainer. And that unlawful detainer then, depending on the trial and circumstances, that will go on your record. And then at some point, if you may leave after the unlawful detainer, or you work out a deal, even if you work out a deal, it can stay on your record. And then if you're still on the premises and you're supposed to leave, then the court can issue what's called a writ of restitution, where they force the sheriff to move in and kind of pull you out, throw your furniture on the lawn, things like that. Any time between those 3 points of data, people can leave. People can leave prior to a notice from threats from a landlord saying, I'm going to evict you, and that may force them to move. This has been kind of shown a lot more in the Latinx community. I think there's a lot of fear of contact with ICE or other kind of dynamics. They may leave what's called self-eviction prior to the notice. They may leave during that notice to filing period. And they may leave between the filing period and the writ of restitution, where they actually lock out the individual. And the trends that we can see is King County, over this time period of 2004 to 17, has had the highest rate of unlawful detainers. It has been on a downward trend, but I think part of my theory is that it's been downwards because a lot of King County has seen a lot of displacement out of King County. And counties like Pierce County have been seeing more increases of lower income or vulnerable populations, and possibly also a lot of gentrification pressure from Seattle pushing folks down towards the Tacoma area, and Seattle pushing people into the King County area. So they've been seeing a little bit of an increase in unlawful detainers, but not too much. But Pierce County is the second highest. Overall, we looked at 271,000 cases since 2004. We calculate that 1 in 55 Washington adults had an unlawful detainer between 2013 and 17, which is about 1.8% of the population. And close to 400,000 adults were named in eviction individually since 2004. This map shows basically where the highest rates or risk of eviction is located. Pierce County has the highest rate. It has a 50% higher risk of eviction than the rest of the state. And King County actually is pretty low, but what's interesting is that a lot of the evictions, and I'll show you in a second, are actually bulked down in South King County. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Just real quickly, how we got this data, we actually used advanced computer techniques to mine court records, to extract addresses and names. We're also working on looking at causes and consequences of the eviction filing itself. With this information, we're able to extract addresses and do an estimation on the demographics, in other words, the gender or sex of the individual, as well as the race and ethnicity of the individual based on their last name. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll kind of keep the math a little hidden right here. But when we do this calculation, when we see what are the gender ratios of evictions by county, we see that for the most part across most of Washington that women were being named in eviction filings far more, upwards to 10 or 20% higher than the rest of, than men in particular. King County actually has had more men named in eviction filings, but not by very much. Only few, maybe like 2 to 5% lower. Men have been named 2 to 5% higher than women. So anything that falls below this line basically means that more men are being named in eviction filings, and then anything that's above the line, more women have been facing eviction filings. So I'm unsure why more men were being named in that, but I think that's part of the demographics of the county in particular. When we map where evictions are happening, we see that, whoops, went too fast. South King County actually had about 57% of all of King County's eviction filings. Another thing that's interesting, Seattle only had 27%. East Side, around, this includes Bellevue and even into the Cascades, had only 15.2%. And all the other kind of tertiary locations had about 6%, such as Vashon Island and a couple other spaces. So the bulk of evictions that occur, the unlawful detainers occur in the South King County area. This is also the location where you have the most diversity in the King County region as well. So you can see from this map on the right-hand side, the darker the red, the more diverse the neighborhood is. South King County obviously has some of the most diverse, but South Seattle has the most diverse neighborhoods, but South King County has a larger distribution of diversity because you can see that they're orange and light green. This is in large part due to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and persons of color being displaced out of the Seattle core into the South King County spaces. When we calculate the eviction rates amongst men and women and different racial groups, we find that women were being evicted 2% higher than men during this 1-year period that we were looking at. But what was really shocking was that Black-headed households were being evicted upwards of 4 times higher than whites. It's 300% more amongst Black adults. The eviction rate amongst Black adults was 300% higher than the eviction rate within white adults. When we look at sex and race, we see that Black females are being evicted 7 times more than white females, so 600% higher than white females, and Black males are being evicted 5.4 times higher than white males. So that's about 440% higher. Astronomical numbers. This graph alone helped settle a case with the ACLU and the Northwest Justice Project, which was on disparate impact of evictions because of the absolute huge disparity that Black households face when it comes to eviction. We did a little bit of further study with 2013 to 2017, and we looked at the Puget Sound region, Snohomish, King County, and Pierce. We also had data from Whatcom, so we threw that in there too. Pierce County had an astronomically large eviction rate amongst Black households. This is, each of these 4 bars represents the 4 most prominent racial and ethnic groups in each of the counties, where green is Asian, orange is Black, purple is Latinx, and pink is white. And this bar, just to this day, every time I see this, I just get blown away. This basically means that over 5 years, from 2013 to 17 in Pierce County, 18% of the Black population was named an unlawful detainer. That's 1 in 6 Black adults. And what's really troubling about Pierce and King County is both have about a 9% Black population. In King County, it's about a 9.6% eviction rate amongst Black adults, which is about 1 in 11 Black adults being named in an eviction filing. And Snohomish shows 6.1%. That's 1 in 16. Just to kind of give you like an idea where this fits on the scale, the average national eviction rate is about 2%, right? So King County right now is about 5 times higher than the national average when it comes to eviction rates. When we look at the diversity of neighborhoods where evictions are happening, from the left-hand side is more white, to the far right-hand side is more BIPOC. We see that evictions have been increasing as the neighborhoods become more diverse, and amongst those households within each of those neighborhoods, Black households, the green bar, are facing much higher rates of eviction in these different types of neighborhoods. Finally, we look at also the rent, how much on average, this is using Zillow data, what was the average rent, or the median rent, I'm sorry, for every neighborhood. And we're seeing that what's interesting is that evictions happen most in the very, very lowest cost neighborhoods in the King County area. And still within these spaces, Black adults are being evicted much higher than anybody else. So in the lowest standard deviation of a rent, we see that Black evictions are about 7.2%. In the next standard deviation, we see that Black evictions are about 5%, but irregardless, wherever there's a Black representation, there's a huge rate of evictions amongst Black households. This is very interesting about the cost of rent, that evictions happen in the lowest or most affordable spaces, kind of speaks to the dynamic of these ideas of displacement and gentrification pressures that have been happening in the King County region. In particular, there's a lot of competition for lower income spaces, especially for people wanting to stay in the areas. And so this is an interesting finding here. We also tracked eviction rates kind of through time. In 2006, we found that in King County, a lot of evictions were happening in the South King County area and South Seattle and the South King County area. But when we fast forward to 2017, the rates of eviction actually are happening further south in the South King County area. So in some ways, the risk of eviction is moving more south within the King County area, out of Seattle and towards Pierce County and Tacoma. This is also where poverty has been increasing over the past, this is from 2000, 2016. There's been a really high increase in poverty overall. In the darker red is like 12 to 35% increase in poverty in some of these tracts. And rent is also cheapest in the South King County area. This is a driver that's been pushing a lot of people out of Seattle and out of the Bellevue area, forcing them into, not forcing, but people wanting to move probably by choice to South King County. But that displacement and destination dynamic creates competition for spaces and allows landlords to raise rents, which can then put vulnerable populations at risk. Again, remember towards the beginning, a lot of eviction happens to those that are the most rent burdened amongst the population. So if someone comes in, they can afford, $200 more a month or something like that. The market can really drive that up. So it's important to consider how that plays a role. And then again, the risk of eviction has been really concentrating a lot when we look at the whole Puget Sound region area. The highest risk is happening in like the downtown Tacoma or downtown Everett areas. And in King County, it's happening in a few places, but it's even higher in these Pierce County and Snohomish County areas. But what happens in King County, most evictions are happening in the more suburban spaces. So areas like Auburn, Kent, and Renton, things like that. So just an overview of what the findings are. We use this enumeration record to scrape court records. We find a high rate of Black evictions in Pierce and King County in particular. Eviction filings are moving south over time. In King County, filings cluster in the suburbs, but in segregated urban neighborhoods of Tacoma and Everett, high rates of eviction within neighborhoods with high diversity and low rent. When I was running statistical models, the level of diversity in a neighborhood was the biggest predictor of an eviction, and the level of rent too. And evictions are highest in neighborhoods with increasing Black and Latinx groups, lower education, and fewer new movers. In other words, these are areas that are destinations for Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. So real quick, I want to talk about how we got to these patterns, but I lost my mouse to try and expand. There it is. I was going to expand my view here and just stop for 1 second to see if anybody had any clarifying questions real quick or comments about this section. Feel free to just unmute yourself.
I just had a question as to whether or not, do you ever break down the definition of Black? Like, do we know, are we talking about recent immigrants from Somalia, Haiti, Ethiopia, or like Kenyan, Nigerian populations? Or are we talking more Black Americans that have lived here for a long time? Yeah.
No, that's a fantastic question. That's actually come up a lot. It's hard to differentiate the two, but from my analysis, I've seen that most most of the neighborhoods in Seattle that are still BIPOC and also in South King County, there's a lot of immigrant populations, but by and large, this is mostly Black Americans from what I can see. But it's hard within the data to kind of determine it. So this is kind of looking at the whole of both Black and Indigenous, but I would say that the majority, if not 80, 90% of them are Black Americans.
And Tim, this is Nancy. I was going back to one of your first slides about South King County at 57%. That really aligns with what we've said on homelessness issues. It was when rent went up $100 per month in Seattle, it could increase homelessness by up to 10%. But when rent went up $100 in South King County, it could impact homelessness and increase up to 35 to 42%. And I think that's because once you've hit South King County, that's basically the lowest rents you're going to find in the region. I mean, unless you go further south into Pierce County, but even those rents are going up now. So is that the same correlation that you would see based on the data that you have?
Absolutely. I think what's going on there is, if you really think about it, if you make $40,000 a year, there's a limited number of apartments you could afford, or even 50,000, right? Those apartments are only located in certain neighborhoods, right? Mm-hmm. And as that one, let's see if I can find it real quick, but as this graph here on the right-hand side is showing, this is where the cheapest rent is in King County. These are the few spaces where there's the lowest income populations can't afford to move, right? These low-income populations are also the most vulnerable to eviction and homelessness, soft or hard displacement, however you want to put it. And so, you know, $100 increase on a $1,000 apartment versus a $100 increase on a $3,000 apartment are two, you know, that's that mobility curve I was telling you about. You know, that's two ends of the spectrum. So, you know, a 35% increase, especially in South King County, makes a lot of sense because that's where, unfortunately, a lot of folks have been forced to move. So, I think a lot about it. I'm developing this new model that estimates like where affordable housing is at, and some of the first models basically show like there's really only a few tracks that 30% of area median income households can move to, and 50% area median households, and 80%. You know, those are below. That's the poverty level there of those different groups, but there really are, you know, just a handful of tracks that fair market rent is available for those spaces. So, and those are at high competition because of population growth and all the other reasons.
Right. We've had 2 fires in our downtown core in the last 3 years that have almost eliminated any rentals for under $1,000. It's just very, very sad.
Yeah. That's
Hi,
tragic.
Tim. This is Benita. I know this is outside of the time frame of your research, but what is your conjecture on the impact, if any, of the moratorium on evictions based as a result of COVID?
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, I have like too many slides, and so I'm going to like jump around to some things here. So the next part was basically going to talk about the history of redlining and housing covenants that led to displacement of folks out of Seattle, and this homeownership gap and all these other kind of things too. This massive wealth gap is the biggest issue amongst, you know, the reason why Black and Indigenous folks are and persons of color are facing a lot of evictions because they can't afford it. But I was going to get into conjecture. This map shows the growth of BIPOC households over the past 40 years, especially them pushing out of segregated Seattle into South King County. But I've been doing a lot of work lately on this housing precarity risk model. And in terms of, I'm going to show this graph here real quick. This is, and Benita, you know, help guide me if I'm going away from your question here and if I don't answer it necessarily. But we've been working a lot on what do we expect to happen after all the moratoriums lift, after, you know, there's a large vaccination rate. There's a huge population that's at risk of eviction in general prior to the pandemic. The pandemic exacerbated those conditions because the pandemic featured unemployment amongst low income and working class households. So in other words, what does that mean? That basically means that folks that were struggling before and facing risk of eviction are now at higher risk. But not only that, you have populations that weren't necessarily at risk prior to the pandemic are now in risk because they were restaurant workers, they were, you know, service workers or industries that were really impacted for a year for unemployment, finding a job, all this kind of stuff. And just, you know, I don't know about y'all, but all my people have been really struggling too. And so there's this mental health capacity too that's really been impacting a lot. So basically, we did this calculation where this is looking at, I'm not going to, you know, this is internal data that's not necessarily ready for public, but I wanted to share it with you because of y'all's position. But this is over 800 counties in the United States. We calculated the kind of how are they performing in terms of evictions to each other, right? So anybody who falls to the left of this black line means that they're doing pretty well. They have a low rate of eviction. They are, each dot represents one county. And so there's a lot of people that are kind of like have a below national average eviction rate, right? But then there's a lot of counties, a very few counties that have a very high eviction rate, upwards of 6 times higher than the national average. So these are like your high evictors. These are people that like have no tenant protections. They're very aggressive in evicting, things like that. So, okay, all right, so that's 2019. This is the prior. And this right here is how each of those counties are performing during the pandemic as compared to their prior time versus now. This looks weird, but there's 2 things to take away from this. People that are evicting high or just whatever rate they're evicting at, all these dots are kind of close to that red line. That means that whatever your kind of your habit in evicting is going to be similar to your habit in the future, right? So San Francisco, for example, has a lot of policies and a lot of organizers and a lot of people that prevent evictions. And during the pandemic, they only had 45 evictions. The rest of the 9-county Bay Area had over 1,000. San Francisco is one of the most dense areas. So they're doing something that's really protecting people, right? They have a lot of really active things going on. Contra Costa County, which is east of there, has a lot of the displacement. In other words, it's more of a South King County than it is anything else in the Bay Area. They have seen over 300 to 400 evictions during the pandemic. And that's largely because they did not have, they're the destination of a lot of BIPOC households like South King County is. They have a lot of diversity, but they don't have a lot of protections. And those protections have allowed a lot more evictions during the pandemic, right? So these blue dots basically mean that during the pandemic in 2021, on average, what we expect in terms of performance of eviction, overall evictions are happening a little bit higher than we expected they would, than prior years, right? The eviction rate's still low because evictions are not happening as fast, but this is a different kind of model. It's showing, okay, given this year's performance, how well are they doing? They're evicting more, right? Now, this is during a time of moratorium. Once those moratoriums lift, I expect that a lot of counties are going to start passing into this red line, this danger zone in here, right? A lot of these evictions are going to start moving way higher than what we would expect given the population, what we expect given the low number of evictions. And that's what people have been calling the eviction cliff. That is going to happen at a rate that basically there's going to be a couple things that slow it down. One is whatever policy protections are in place to kind of help prevent that. Two, there's the level that the courts are able to process these evictions. There's going to be a big stack of them, right? And it's going to take as much time as possible to process that. So then eventually what you're going to see is just an exponential increase over the next 6 months to a year. You'll start seeing just a higher rate. We don't have the data to really tell. Whoever tells you they know is lying to you, but we expect there's going to be a high rate. So remember I said back a while back, 2%, the eviction rate in the nation was 2%, right? Recent studies have shown that about 15% of renting households are unsure if they can afford their rent, right? 2%, that's the population that gets evicted, the people that can't pay their rent. I'm not going to say that the eviction rate will jump from 2 to 15% on a national average, but I would not be surprised if the eviction rate goes from 2% to 5 or 10%, depending on the level of protections. To put that in perspective, that's 5 times higher than what we have now. So let's say that, South King County, had roughly 2,000 unlawful detainers, 3,000 unlawful detainers. That could get up to 7,000, 10,000, 15,000 in 1 year, right? So these are the dynamics that we're dealing with here. And what that will do, if we all recall, what was the big topic we were talking about in terms of housing prior to the pandemic? It was homelessness, right? All of this is going to exacerbate that. A lot of research shows that an eviction will increase the likelihood of you experiencing homelessness by about 20%. That means 1 in 5 people that get evicted become homeless. And that's only if you're just dealing with eviction. That's not dealing with domestic violence issues, with children involved, with prior homeless exposure. That's just eviction on its own. It's one of the top predictors of homelessness. So I think that, I'm bracing for the worst, to be honest with you. Yesterday, when I heard the CDC stopped the moratorium, it just shook me. And I've been invited as a White House consultant, and we've been meeting on a weekly basis talking about the eviction crisis with some of the top policy advisors, and they're kind of lost. They're scared. And I think that it's up to the local jurisdictions to stand out. That example I gave of San Francisco is one of the best examples that I know of. It's policy protections, aggressive organizers pointing out here's where evictions are happening, and it's also having renter assistance and legal representation. Those are the 3 things I think that would really help stem evictions.
Thank you.
Checking the time here. I guess, yeah, I could talk more about the housing precarity risk model. Maybe is some place to kind of look into this. But if you go to our website, urbandisplacement.org, scroll down, you'll see the housing displacement model. Basically, what this model shows is where is the highest risk of displacement and eviction impacted by the pandemic's unemployment rate, right? This basically highlights where the most households that risk displacement and eviction, in other words, housing instability, that left side of the curve of soft and hard displacement, that's where it's located. If you look across the whole map, I highlighted the South and King County area and the Pierce County area because those are the areas that have the highest number of households that are at the most precarious. They're the least resilient to the pandemic shock, right? And you can zoom in and see which streets are there and things like that. But, you know, the relationship of what's going on in South King County is highly related to what's going on in Seattle, and it's related to what's going on in Pierce County as well. So it's important to kind of, you know, to work with them too, because Seattle is pushing a lot of people out. It's increasing population in South King County area. Folks are moving, you know, out of Pierce into South King County. There's a lot of different dynamics that are going on there. And we can disaggregate things like eviction. These are the areas with the highest like hard displacement. Now, this is a both of those maps are very, very, very conservative because these are just statistical estimates. And for the most part, when we compare this to national data, we're right on, but there's a lot of areas that are actually evicting more than not. And so it's important to try and talk to particularly like tenant representative attorneys who are, you know, the Housing Justice Project, for example, plays a big role in representing folks with eviction in South King County and Seattle. And they have a really good, strong kind of count of more recent evictions. But as you can see, you know, there's a few places that are orange, which are high risk of eviction in here. And then there's, you know, a lot of areas in Pierce County. And a lot of these spaces in particular are where segregation and destination households who've been displaced already from other areas are located at. So I think, you know, Pierce County, Tacoma, and South King County are really the battleground when it comes to evictions and displacement risk, things like that. And I think that's, I zoomed in a little bit more in the South King County area. Here's the I-5 corridor. On the west side of that is some of those, and also further on the right-hand side too. But with that, I'll just stop it right there. You all know what's going on in your cities more than I do, and happy to, you know, talk a little bit through some of those things or any kind of clarification I can have too. But I just really appreciate y'all's time. Thank you so much.
All right, any questions for Tim? This is a lot to take in. Brian.
I missed it, but the section of the presentation, which you're going to go through, the history of Seattle, I'd be really interested in that. I was wondering if your presentation would be available to view after this meeting sometime.
Yeah, I can throw up a link. If people wanted, I could try to go through it real quickly. Would that be Nancy shaking her head? She seems like she's in charge, so.
They only let me think I am. I think if we could have access to the slides that you provided, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. I can do that.
Tim, if I have a follow-up question later, can I email you and ask it?
Yes, 100%. Please do. My email is timthomas@berkeley, berkeley.edu. Somehow got the only Tim Thomas in there. That was a weird one.
Thank you.
Tim, are there any methods for finding out where people are going once they are evicted? I mean, with the information that you already have, are you able to sort of somehow figure out where they were relocated to?
That is a huge question and has been boggling a lot of urban planners and neighborhood scholars for a long time. But we actually have just purchased through this grant that we got to do the housing precarity risk model, a household level data set that has origin and destinations for most Americans in the US. And we want to link that data to eviction data. And I'm assuming we could at least link 10 to 20, maybe 30% of the eviction filings to this data set. We could then track them over time to see what happens to them. But anecdotal evidence, a lot of people, end up in homelessness, or they move to cheaper areas, or just aren't found. They kind of just fall off the map a little bit. But it's likely that, so migration theory does say that people make short moves, right? People don't really go that far away. Like, there's kin, there's friends, there's jobs, there's things that keep people in place, right? So they're not going to move very far away. And so if the nearby location has affordable housing nearby, then it's likely that they're going to move closer by, or if there are a lot of options, like New York is just a huge city. There's so many options, so close, and you have a transit system, so people can move from pretty far boroughs to another. In the Puget Sound region, it's just there are fewer options, and so I would assume that they would kind of stay in the South King County area if they could, but really, they're not. The idea that they're going to migrate to California or something like that is very, very, very low, like 5% chance that they're actually going to move that far away, unless there's family there that could help them through that period of time. But those are the factors that kind of play into that.
So Tim, I've got a question in regard to solutions. When we're talking policy, you said one of your goals is to, you're the research person and, working policy. One of the pressures that we have on us is moving forward, for example, into our Vision 2050, we have like prescriptions for absorbing urban density in many of our cities, which requires redevelopment, right? And so even in our city, recently there was an entire mobile park community that was displaced in order to put in, was affordable housing, right? I think 350 units. I think Nicole or Eric can correct me, but so it increased affordable housing in the long run. It's a beautiful development, but in the meantime, you've got this displacement of this entire intact community. So when we're trying to address the problem from a policy standpoint, it would be really helpful to see possibly, in a sense, maybe eliminate any in your data sets redevelopment where the goal of a particular sector of the population that's moving is a really part of the solution process. Do you see what I'm saying? So if you take that out, then you can get a little bit more accurate locations or geography of some of these people that are moving for pure reasons that are maybe solvable. Like our displacement situation was part of a solution. See what I'm saying? Right. Do you have anything like that built into your data collection?
Yeah, unfortunately we don't. I mean, right now there's so much low-hanging fruit, and just like looking at the propensity of eviction, that's mostly, but those are things that we want to get into for sure. And that's just in California, we're working closely with the state's Housing and Community Development Program to collect more data like that, include parcel data, include building information data, and if there was a way to include plans or things like that to be able to predict, like, okay, this is an at-risk space. And that's kind of the whole purpose of the housing precarity model, was to kind of highlight, like, look, these are the most sensitive communities. These are the areas that would be displaced with whatever development, even if it's nearby. One of my students saw that, he just got a paper published using this data set, looking at renovations and building demolitions and new building permits, and he found that renovations, basically highly predicts evictions, even renovations, right? Building demolitions, impacts a small number of people. Usually there's a plan to kind of involve, protecting those folks or things like that. But really it's, what's slipping through is even other kind of things that increase the value of the space too. I think that, yeah, I'd be happy to talk more too about potential policy recommendations on that at another time. But I think that, you know, it's on the forecast of the next thing to add on there is those dynamics. Thank you for bringing that up.
How about, are there any statistics on like the nationalities of landlords, or like as more Black Americans become landlords themselves, is that, I don't know, is that showing up in any data anywhere as being more helpful in terms of, you know, our Black landlords filing less eviction? Or I'm just wondering if that helps. I know several Black Americans who own property and are landlords, and, you know, I think even the ones I know are, you know, get frustrated when there's people who are in their property and not paying rent. And so, and especially, I guess my other part of that question is, any word on how our state governments are doing in being able to pass along the federal funding to landowners so that they can be, you know, made more whole in that? And I'm wondering if maybe there's any trends that we're predicting where maybe people, I'm just wondering, like, for people who weren't paying their rent but were collecting either unemployment or were still working, are we thinking that that will affect the trends in any way? Based on, you know, if they weren't paying their rent, I'm just wondering what we're thinking about that.
Right. Well, I think that, you know, there's a study recently that said nationally, like the $15 minimum wage still doesn't cut it in terms of affordability, you know, allowing households to afford things. So I think that to some degree, a lot of the, like, ERA, the eviction rental assistance, that the federal government came out $42 billion, I think 5.1 billion has been divvied out, and a lot of it's been because of, you know, as you all well know, state level kind of red tape of trying to get that through. Some people will face like 3 to 6 months to get ERA funds from the Fed through the state. So any way to kind of speed that up would be great. And in terms of like unemployment, it seems to me that if there was a bit of an eviction crisis in the prior before the pandemic, it's still hitting the same people, and it's almost like the ERAs and unemployment insurance to some degree is helping like fill a gap that was happening prior to the pandemic, right? It's helping raise more funds to allow tenants to afford the rent, but again, it's not getting to a lot of the landlords, and what that may do is, you know, lead to more landlords selling off. And there's definitely a lot of evidence that there's larger corporations picking up these spaces, depending on the different city. You know, they're just kind of prospecting and even sitting on potentially affordable housing. And so that's one of the secret little things that nobody's really looking at. Like, for example, what's the impact of Airbnb in taking away affordable housing in different places like city of Seattle and things like that? Like, I think the Seattle has like, you can't have more than 3 or 5 Airbnbs, but there's data that shows that there's like 300 Airbnbs under one person's name and like 150 under, you know. So these are, you know, kind of things that kind of been flying under the radar in terms of like taking away affordable housing and vacancy and it being repurposed for you know, being commodified to a large degree. And so I think that I don't know where Washington is in terms of getting it out. There's a lot of difficulty in that, but you know, my biggest fear is that will lead to that. It'll lead to that kind of mass sell-off. And when it comes to your first question about Black landlords maybe evicting less, I think there's definitely research that shows that people of similar affinity are able to relate to different problems more and things like that. So that's the problem you have with like white landlords with Black tenants. There's kind of a a cultural difference there that could lead to discrimination. But yeah, there's definitely Black landlords that have been frustrated. When I was working with the legislature in 2019, you know, I talked to a Black landlord that was very frustrated with, you know, tenants destroying the place and things like that. That's why they passed one of the bills that helps refund the costs of a destroyed unit based on the tenant reaction. But for the most part, what I saw was a lot of older tenants and people that fall within that population that I described before, you know, single mothers with kids and older tenants, things like that. They would raise issue about mold in the apartment or appliances breaking down, and that would increase the pressure of eviction on them. They're just afraid to mention that kind of stuff. So there's different dynamics, I think, that are playing in terms of, like, you don't want to lose your cheap, affordable space. And to answer your question in general, there has not been a lot of research on the racial differences with landlords, but there has been some research on showing, like, this people don't want to complain about unlivable conditions because they don't want to risk that eviction. You know, they may be close to falling behind. They don't want to do anything. They want to fly under the radar, not get caught. And so any kind of attraction to that will increase the likelihood of evictions. Another struggle, you know, yeah. So there's a lot of issues with that. I see a hand raised at the bottom.
Dana?
Thank you. A question around reasons for eviction. So my guess is that predominantly it is inability to pay rent, but how does the reasons break out in the data as far as why people are being evicted? Because I also think that makes a difference when it comes to us working on policy. So to your earlier point, we have it's actually modeled after Tuckwillah's policy, a rental housing inspection program that allows us to go in and inspect so that people don't have to come forward and say, I've got mold, and it takes at least a little bit of that fear out. But I'm curious around reasons for eviction, because I think that also matters.
Right. Well, you know, before the SB 56, I think 5600, I forget, the one that the 14-day pay or vacate went in, it was a little bit of the Wild West when it came to things. People, you know, a lot of no cause evictions, a lot of loopholes in terms of, like, trying to get people evicted were happening a lot more. I'm unsure, like, I think it's improved a lot. But, you know, what the research shows in general with qualitative data is that, yes, the reason why you're getting evicted is because you're falling behind on rent. Well, the reason why maybe you get picked out of other people that may be falling behind on rent are extra additional issues that I kind of mentioned before. You know, if the police, you know, there's research that talks about, you know, people who get the police called on them, you know, if domestic violence situation, the police show up, things like that, or some kind of noise complaint or something can happen. And, you know, that raises the alarm in terms of being called out for a non-payment eviction, right? And it's a weird kind of, like, domino effect of what happens. Strangely, one of the top evictors are public housing authorities too, because they have a lot of rules that you have to abide by, and you know, sometimes if you have a friend coming over, they get caught on camera and things like that. That can lead to an eviction. So I think that that is why, you know, things like source of income discrimination is important to reduce. Rental registries to ensure that people are maintaining good properties and not just evicting for no reason. Just cause is a very, very important policy to implement in that. But also ensuring that there's legal representation for folks facing eviction. One of the biggest things I've been advocating for is that there would be a fund similar to when, you know, you're charged with a criminal charge, you get a public defender. If you're charged with an eviction, you get a public defender as well to kind of help navigate that process. Not only would it help the tenant, but it also helps, you know, negotiate a deal with the landlord too, so that it can be made whole.
So really quick follow-up question, just so that we're all in the same place on definitions. In the case of your data, it only looked at court cases. I know there's confusion, at least when we hear testimony from the public around, I was evicted versus my lease wasn't renewed. So how is that playing into this conversation?
Yeah, that's the mushy part there, right? I find that if you have the sheriff show up at your door and throw your stuff on the lawn, forcibly moving you out, evicting you, that can be as damaging as you moving yourself out prior to an unlawful detainer or right after an unlawful detainer, because it goes onto your record. It's the future impacts, right? If you have nowhere to go, people are wanting to be, obedient and try to move out. You don't have to be forcibly moved to face similar consequences if you just move on your own. So the term eviction, a lot of people use it loosely. There's eviction notices. Did you get a notice or not? There's the unlawful detainer, and then there's the writ of restitution, the sheriff coming out. And so what we measured was the unlawful detainer. That means that not everybody left, but I would say close to 70 to 80% of the folks did, either forcibly or non-forcibly did leave. A lot of those people worked out deals with their landlords, but there's a big issue of default judgments where about 40% of cases end in default judgment, meaning that no one shows up to court. And that basically allows the landlord to get what they want right away. But, if they had defense, some people don't even know they're being evicted. I have a PhD. If I had an eviction notice, I would be lost. And I don't know, there's so many things I don't know in where I'm at. So there's just a lot of complication with that. And also just managing, trying to keep a job. There's a lot of stressors outside of the eviction preventing that too. But I don't know if that's kind of answering your question. I might be getting into the rambling phase of my talk here, but.
That cover it, Dana?
Yeah, I think that it's probably down into the weeds. I said it's more, we have people come to council meetings and say, I've been evicted, and what they really mean is that their lease wasn't renewed. So no legal action was taken. The landlord has decided for whatever reason, and it's always a little bit squishy to be able to tell, is it some of these things or not, but those are being called evictions, and they're technically not. I mean, I don't think so. I guess that's my question is how are those things looked at? Because if you've got somebody that's come to the end of their year lease and the landlord says, I'm not, with the 60 days or following the rules, it's not technically an eviction, but it causes a displacement. So I think that's
right.
The hard
yeah,
part.
And that's, yeah, you're 100% right. And that's why it's so hard to do this research too, is exactly those kind of things. Like, so your lease wasn't renewed. Well, technically that could have the same effects as if the sheriff threw out your stuff, because you're forced to move into a different space. You're expecting to stay there. There's nowhere else nearby. So you still go through the same, you can, like, maybe more often than not, go through the same motions and consequences of what a unlawful detainer or writ or forced, hard displacement happens. That I would put the non-renewable lease in that soft displacement category, but it's all part of that displacement dynamic on that curve. And so that mobility, choosing, having to move when you didn't want to, that's the big problem, right? I want to get beyond talking about eviction. I want to talk about the preceding conditions and the consequences of mobility, right? So it's like a nebulous ball of sorts that leads to that displacement, or that preceded that housing insecurity, for sure. Someone losing their lease can lead to homelessness. Where it's unclear. I don't think it would be as much as an eviction, because there's a lot of legal ramifications, but it's unclear. It is a sticky, mushy situation, though.
Thanks.
Thank you. Sonari?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag, we don't have the chat, I was throwing this in chat, that the housing, King County Housing, the Housing Justice Project does have some 2019 data where they've broken down the eviction filings in King County in particular by reason. Again, it doesn't get to your question, Mayor Ralph, in terms of the either the non-renewal of the lease, or the other thing that we sometimes see is a mutual termination agreement. So where the tenant and the landlord sit down and say, okay, we're agreeing that you're leaving early. It's not going to look like an eviction in the court, but we're going to sit down, and sometimes we see those happen in cases where maybe a tenant has mental health issues and maybe shouldn't be signing something like that on their own. There are a whole number. I've learned a lot about this, I would say, in the last 2 years, having come into this role with very little knowledge of this world, but we were lucky enough to hire someone who has done a lot of this work over the last 5 or 6 years. So it's been really educational in understanding all the different ways that kind of soft and hard displacement happens. But we are trying, we have not made much progress so far, but we are trying to figure out how we stand up better data from the county side on evictions too, so we can understand the scope and scale of the problem. And Angela, I can send you the King County, the Housing Justice Project data site to send around.
Yeah, I worked a lot with HJP, and they would answer a lot of these questions a lot better than me. I'm the weirdo academic who gets to sit and think about these things, but HJP has been on the ground for many, many years. I think their managing attorney, Edmund Witter, he's one of the guys, when I talk to him, like, scary how smart he is in terms of like vast knowledge of reaching all these areas too. And so and he's able to look at both sides too, so it's interesting dynamic.
Okay, anything else? Tim, I think we held you longer than we had scheduled, but that is because the data is scary, it's fascinating, it's something that we clearly have a great deal of concern over, and that cliff that you were talking about, we've all known is coming. Marty sent me an email while we were listening and wondering if Skip has begun laying out a strategy to connect with vulnerable landlords who are thinking about selling and finding ways to buy up NOAA product before it hits the investment market. And I don't think we have had that conversation, but I certainly think it's one that we need to look at very closely.
If I could step in as an outsider, I would say that would be huge, especially for South King County's case, right? To Tracy's comment about knocking out existing affordable housing to build new affordable housing, that may be one of the biggest things that y'all are facing too. And like things like TOPA in California, tenant opportunity to purchase, would be an interesting model to look at, allowing, we've been actually advocating things like community land trusts, things that maintain those kind of things. So looking at opportunities to purchase is huge. Our website, Urban Displacement Project, has a lot of anti-displacement policy recommendations too, so happy to pass those along. But I really appreciate y'all's time, and thanks for having me speak too much.
Oh, thank you so much, Tim. We appreciate it.